The decision to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 remains one of the most contentious and debated topics in modern history. This unprecedented action was driven by a combination of military, political, and strategic considerations, each of which has been scrutinized over the decades. Below is my overview of the key justifications presented at the time and the criticism that continue to shape the debate today.
A million tons of water alive with deadly rays, awe-inspiring in its significance for man.
The primary justification was to bring a swift end to World War II. The United States estimated that a prolonged war, including an invasion of Japan, would cost hundreds of thousands of American and Allied lives, along with millions of Japanese casualties. President Harry Truman and military planners believed that demonstrating overwhelming force would push Japan to surrender unconditionally, avoiding a prolonged conflict.
The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid many-fold, and the end is not yet. With this bomb, we have now added a new and revolutionary increase in destruction to supplement the growing power of our armed forces. In their present form, these bombs are now in production, and even more powerful forms are in development. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe.
The planned invasion of Japan, codenamed Operation Downfall, was expected to be extremely costly in terms of human life. Estimates varied, but US military planners projected between 250 to 500,000 American casualties and potentially millions of Japanese deaths due to intense resistance. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa in early 1945 showed Japan's willingness to fight to the last soldier and civilian, reinforcing fears that an invasion of the main islands would be devastating. In July 1945, the United States successfully tested its first atomic bomb, changing the course of the war and global politics. With this powerful weapon, the need for Soviet military help in the Pacific War greatly decreased. The Truman administration, wary of how the Soviet Union was acted alone in dominating parts of the post-war Europe, wanted to prevent a similar situation in Northeast Asia. The atomic bomb not only reshaped military strategies, but also played a key role in the growing tensions of the future Cold War. During and after World War II, the Soviet Union took unilateral actions in Eastern Europe to expand its influence and establish a sphere of control. Examples include the imposition of communist governments in countries such as Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria, often disregarding agreements made with Allied powers. The Soviet Union's dominance over these nations through a combination of military presence and political manipulation. These actions fostered significant distrust between the Soviet Union and Western allies, particularly with the United States. For the US, Soviet unilateralism was seen as a direct challenge to shared governance and post-war agreements, such as those established at the Yalta Conference. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan on August 8, 1945, and quickly invaded Manchuria, a Japanese-controlled territory in Northeast Asia. This fulfilled Stalin's promise at Yalta to join the Pacific War within 3 months of Germany's surrender. However, the US feared that Soviet military involvement would lead to unilateral actions similar to those in Europe, with the Soviet asserting control over parts of Asia. The Truman administration, which came to power after Franklin Delano Roosevelt's death in April 1945, was cautious of Soviet intentions. The US wanted to limit Soviet influence in the post-war order, particularly in strategically significant regions like Northeast Asia. With the successful testing of the atomic bomb in July 1945, the US now possessed a decisive tool to end the war without needing Soviet assistance. This reduced the urgency to include the Soviet Union in the final phases of the conflict. The US aimed to avoid a repeat of the European scenario where Soviet troops occupied and influenced large areas. In Northeast Asia, similar unilateral Soviet actions could have resulted in a divided Korea or Soviet influence extending into Japan or the Pacific. The US had invested approximately $2 billion, equivalent to over $30 billion today, in the development of nuclear weapons through the Manhattan Project. Some argue that the bombs needed to be used to justify the massive financial and scientific investment and to show that the project was a success. Despite suffering immense firebombing and military defeats, Japan's government showed no clear sign of surrender before the atomic bombings. The Potsdam Declaration of July 26, 1945, had warned Japan of prompt and utter destruction if it refused to surrender, yet Japan ignored the ultimatum. Even after Hiroshima, Japan's leadership remained divided on surrender. Only after Nagasaki, and the intervention of Emperor Hirohito, did Japan formally surrender on August 15, 1945.
General MacArthur steps to the microphone to take charge of the historic proceedings and sternly faces his conquered enemy.
The terms and conditions upon which surrender of the Japanese imperial forces is here to be given and accepted are contained in the instrument of surrender now before you.
The bombs caused immense civilian casualties. Over 100,000 people died instantly, and tens of thousands more succumbed to radiation sickness, burns, and injuries.
the all-shattering devastation in which was born the atomic age. In its birth pangs, 75,000 people were killed, 70,000 injured.
Critics argue that the indiscriminate destruction of civilian population violated moral and ethical principles, particularly given the already weakened state of Japan.
Here and there, an isolated structure reminds the onlooker that here was once a city.
Some historians argue that Japan was already on the brink of surrender due to conventional bombings, the Soviet declaration of war and naval blockade that crippled its economy. A demonstration of the atomic bomb on an inhabited island or a military target rather than civilian cities might have been enough to force Japan's surrender. The Soviet Union's declaration of war against Japan on August 8, 1945, and its rapid invasion of Manchuria severely weakened Japan's position. Some argue that Japan would have surrendered shortly thereafter, regardless of the atomic bombs, especially since the Soviets had no intention of negotiating favorable terms for Japan. The bombings set a dangerous precedent for the use of nuclear weapons, leading to the Cold War arms race. The radiation effects led to a long-term suffering, including cancer, birth defects, and environmental devastation.
Some of the falsehoods circulated about radiation effects are trivial, but upsetting. They're beamed right at one's self-esteem.
And will eventually result in a race of bald-headed people. Just imagine it. Imagine yourself with no hair. They'll call you old skinhead, old chrome dome. And that's not all radioactivity will do. It will...
Enough exposure to radiation will cause loss of hair. The treatment, if you'd insist, would be symptomatic. A toupee. But the condition would only be temporary. Your hair would come back. Same color, same cowlick.
Some critics view the bombings as war crimes because they targeted civilian populations rather than purely military objectives. The Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907 and other international agreements have already emphasized the need to avoid unnecessary suffering in warfare. The decision to use atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki remains controversial. Supporters argue that it was necessary to quickly end the war, save lives, and prevent a devastating land invasion. Critics contend that Japan was already nearly surrendered, that the bombings were morally and ethically unjustifiable, and that they set a dangerous precedent for future nuclear conflict.